know Tom Edmonds. Tom Edmonds is the executive director of the Southampton Historical Museum, one of our best friends. Tom has had over 30 years of experience working at historic house museums in Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Florida. He started this current job in 2006, 12 years ago, hard to imagine. And he says he continues to enjoy working every single day. Tom serves on the board of the Hampton Visitors Council, the East End Tourism Alliance, the Hampton Arts Network, and on the Association of Suffolk County Historical Societies. He lives in Mattituck in a wonderful mid-century home. You want to buy it? No. With his wife, Marybeth, and his dog, Daisy, who can see, and his dog can occasionally be seen in the Southampton Dog Park. Please welcome Tom Edmonds.
I'm
sorry.
You've taken up 10 minutes of my time already.
Sorry, Tom.
So you can see the title of this, my talk. I actually gave this talk at Chabad, the Jewish Center. Thank you. I wasn't paying attention. You can see the title of my lecture here. I gave this in 2014 at Chabad, the Southampton Jewish Center. And when I was going to review it, I saw how out of date it already was. So there is some new information. If you saw it at Chabad, it's a little bit different. First, I want to tell you about myself, though. Benny gave me a very nice introduction, but I'm going to go a little farther back, not for too long, but I was born in Lawrence, Kansas. I'm the third or fourth generation of Kansans who were, my ancestors were pioneers in Kansas, and Lawrence, Kansas is mostly white, mostly Protestant. There's a few Catholics, and there was one Jew, and he was called the Jew. He didn't have family. He lived in a kind of a shut-up house on Main Street, and as growing up, every time we passed the house, it was, oh, there's the house of the Jew. Because there's no Jews in Kansas, or if they are, they're hiding. So my family, before they came to Kansas, they actually, some of them settled in Virginia in 1650. So through one relative, I'm related to a lot of the Virginia plantations. I'm a nephew of John Adams. George Washington is a cousin. And this is how I grew up with this oral history. Then one day, I'm about in my 20s. Can you tell where this story's going? I'm in my 20s and my grandmother has her 80th birthday party. And all the tribe arrives, and half the crowd, the women, are all members of DAR. So my grandmother, who's Southern, said she stood up, and there's 20 of her people around her, 20 or 30. She says, well, did you all know we are Jews? And of course, half the room's jaws dropped, the DAR members. And this was never known. This wasn't known to anybody. My grandmother actually was born to two Jewish parents, and this is my mother's mother, so technically I'm a quarter Jew, but nobody knew about this. And her parents, my grandmother's parents, moved to Kansas and bought a hotel, and they went into business and they converted. They became born-again Christians. So my grandmother was really screwed up. She had kind of conflicting background, but that really changed everything for me when I found out that I was one quarter Jew. So the topic has always been of interest to me, and it wasn't until I'm 65, so that was 30 years ago, was I able to do the research and find out more about Jewish history. So that's why I'm so interested in this topic, and I hope you'll find it a little interesting. So, my museum, the Southampton Historical Museum, has 3,000 books and over 10,000 photographs, maps, archival materials on the history and the development of Southampton. 98% of our resources are about English ancestry and Protestant culture. Documentation for the history of other ethnic and religious groups who settled on Long Island is sorely lacking. If we go back to the beginning of Southampton's history, and this is the thing with me, Southampton's history starts 10 to 12,000 years ago with the Paleo Indians who came over here from Europe or possibly across the Bering Strait. So there's a long, long history here, much more than the Protestant ascendant culture that we're used to hearing about. Of course, this changes in the 17th century when the English and the Dutch Protestants supplanted the island's Native American way of life. Today, Long Island's population is, this is amazing, is 52% Catholic, 12% Jewish, and now 7% Protestant. That's amazing. That's an amazing change. So on the left-hand side there, you can see the Sacred Hearts Basilica. On the bottom is the Southampton Jewish Center, and on the upper right is King's Chapel in Hillcrest. This is such an amazing building. This story is not about Jews who live in Southampton and on Long Island. It's about how they got here. So it's too broad of a topic to talk about Jewish life on Long Island, but I'm just going to be talking about how they got here. And the Jewish Center, has everybody been to this place? This is someplace I've always wanted to go. It was built, 20 years ago by Norman Jaffe. It's an incredible building. It's in East Hampton. So Jewish history in New York begins with the founding of Fort New Amsterdam in 1627. 1627, today known as New York City. And you can see Fort Amsterdam right there. That's the significant culture. And look over to the lower right, there's Native Americans in a dugout canoe. So this is a very great early image of New Amsterdam. In 1657, the Dutch ship St. Catherine arrives in New Amsterdam with 23 Sephardic Jews. They leave the Netherlands for Brazil, but evacuate along with other Dutch settlers when Portugal gains control. Peter Stuyvesant, the Dutch Director General of New Amsterdam, wants to deport the Jews and refuses to allow them to disembark from the St. Catherine. Stuyvesant is overruled by the Dutch West India Company. Why? This is very interesting. It is financed by Jewish diamond merchants back in the Netherlands. They're the ones pulling the strings. On board the St. Catherine is a young man named Azar Levy. Has anybody heard of Azar Levy? He's an amazing historical character. After taking leave of the boat, Levy and others are refused full citizenship, or what they called back then burghers, rights by Peter Stuyvesant. Levy eventually wins the right to own a business and property from the Dutch West India Company. He soon becomes one of the most influential merchants in New Amsterdam. In 1658, Levy purchases land and builds his first house at Fort Orange, which is now called Albany, where it was easier for a Jew to own property. So if you look at the map, it's not the way we're used to looking at it. It's going east and west from top to bottom, but if you see the arrow, and you'll see can you see Fort Orange over there? It's underneath the Beaver. And again, look at this great map that shows Native Americans who were in the ocean. They were around just as much as the animals were. Azar later opens a kosher butcher shop in New Amsterdam and eventually builds a slaughterhouse near Wall Street. And here, this map is so great. This is a 1660 map of New Amsterdam, and it's obvious to see where Wall Street is. That's the line on the farther right with the triangles coming out of it. That's Wall Street. And it's in the same location today. Levy becomes a wealthy landowner and trade merchant. He lends money to build the first Lutheran church in New Amsterdam and becomes the estate executor for many of the Christians. And why does that happen? It's because he is constantly in court trying to preserve his rights as a businessman and a homeowner, and he wants to be a citizen. So he's always in court. So he's not an attorney, but he learns how to be an executor of an estate. He learns about rights and also to protect his rights as a Jew. I want to take a closer look at this map because it's so interesting. Can you see the houses are spaced far apart? They have gardens, and what you're looking at on the bottom of the slide here is Pearl Street. So if anybody's familiar with Wall Street, that's Pearl Street. Wall Street goes up and down with the diamond fortifications pointing out of it, and that arc was called King Street at the time, and now it's called Hanover. And Hanover Street, and there's a spike that comes out as Exchange Place. So those streets are in their same location. It's so easy after I looked at this map to go look at Google Maps to see Wall Street. It's the same. The layout is the same. Levy is remembered today in New York City with the Azar Levy Recreational Center, located at, appropriately named, Azar Levy Place and East 23rd Street. Has anybody seen this magnificent building? It's in Kips Bay. It's almost by the East River. It was originally a bathhouse. Here's another great character. Luis Moses Gomez is expelled during the Spanish Inquisition. Jews in Spain who do not convert could be burned on a stake. Gomez has permission from Queen Anne to own a business and property. He soon acquires 4,000 acres near Newburgh and builds this mill house in 1714. But this is incredible. It's still there. The mill house is the oldest house built by a Jew in the Americas that is still in existence. Today it's open to the public as a historic house museum, and it's wonderful. I've been in it. In 1740, Jews are finally allowed to become citizens. Sephardic Jews begin farming on Homestead Plain, which is on the east side of Queens County. Aaron Isaacs is born in Hamburg and joins part of the first wave of German Jews to arrive in New York City. He is in his 20s. Isaacs starts out as a peddler and eventually owns a boat that ships trade goods between New York City and Nantucket. And that smaller ship is called a bark. Aaron decides to settle in East Hampton after several years trading along the coastline and marries Mary Hedges, a Goy, in 1748. His customers include the Gardner family, who he supplies with hay, nutmeg, and mahogany chairs. And we know this because the Gardners kept very accurate records, and they were given to the East Hampton Library. So this was great documentation. The Dominy family, which a lot of you know, made great furniture for 5 generations. The Dominies, it has always been thought that they made their own tools, but it's also been recently documented that some of the tools were made in New York City and were handled and provided to them by a Jewish merchant. Isaacs becomes the middleman for local craftsmen like Daniel Hedges, a shoemaker who takes his shoes to New York City to sell. And that's a early 1750 look at New York City. And Elias Pelletreau, who he finds customers for his gold jewelry and silver plate. And that, a lot of you will know, is the Pelletreau Silver Shop. And I don't know if you know this, but I'm very proud of it, the fact that it is the oldest continuously open shop in the Americas. I could say the Western Hemisphere, but there's a butcher shop that's older in Oxford, England. So I've been thinking about giving money to vegans there to put them out of business. And we could say Western Hemisphere. Isaacs becomes a Christian in 1764, the same year that his son survives infancy and is baptized, which may have influenced his decision to convert. That's the 1711 version of the First Presbyterian Church that's in East Hampton. It looks a little different now, but that's a great illustration. Isaacs converts for either religious reasons or, more likely, because it's easier to be a Christian among other Christians, just like my great-grandparents. Aaron Isaacs and Mary Hedges have 11 children. The British occupation of Long Island during the American Revolution causes many local patriots and their families to move to Connecticut to wait out the war. Aaron, Mary, and their children join others from East Hampton to do the same thing. So they sit out the American Revolution safely in Connecticut. One daughter, Sarah, becomes wife of William Payne and the mother of John Howard Payne, who writes Home Sweet Home, which becomes the most popular song in the U.S., especially during the Civil War. Are you familiar with Home Sweet Home in East Hampton? It's a museum right now. I don't know if you heard the bad news or not, but they've recently discovered that it was not the home of the writer of Home Sweet Home. Did you read this? This is like kills the whole story. But that's okay. It's a great place to go. And the gardens are spectacular. Aaron dies in 1798, leaving his wife and children money and land. Isaacs is a partner with the only other known Jew on the East End at this time. Joseph Jacobs of Southampton is an enterprising businessman who, like most people on Long Island, have many ways to make a living. John Lyon Gardner's ledger again shows that in 1773 he pays both Isaacs and Jacobs for hauling. Joseph Jacobs' will of 1774 says, and this is a quote, "Being very sick, all my debts to be paid, I leave my wife Eleanor, my now dwelling house and home lot. I leave to my children each 100 pounds. The younger children are to have a home in my house till of age. I make my friend Elias Matthews of Southampton executor." Witnesses were Dr. William Smith, Zephaniah Rogers, and Stephen Rogers. Zephaniah, by the way, lived in the house that I work at the Rogers Mansion. He's the grandfather of Captain Albert Rogers. I wish we knew more about him. As the 17th century comes to a close, Jews continue to flee religious intolerance in Europe and in South America to settle in New York City. As revolutionary fever sweeps the colonies in the 1770s, the majority of New York Jews favor independence. The Battle of Long Island in 1776 is the first major battle and the first American defeat. For 7 long years, Long Island is occupied by British forces. Long Island patriots, as I mentioned before, who supported the revolution, flee to Connecticut, including Isaacs, that's a misprint, the Isaacs of East Hampton. So it was a time of terrible hardship here on Long Island. British soldiers were in control. They raided food. They did terrible things to women. It was not a nice time here. People were starving. People were burning their furniture in their fireplaces for heat. The soldiers took everything they could, and I think a lot of you know that where the dog park is, that Penny mentioned, that's where one fort was here in the village. There was another British fort over on Canoe Place, and there was one in Sag Harbor, and I think East Hampton. So British soldiers were all around us here. Beginning in the 1830s, a second wave of German Jews immigrate to the U.S., eventually numbering 250,000 people over a 60-year period. They come with little or no money and become traveling peddlers on the streets of New York City. And slowly they branch out to Long Island by providing much-needed household goods and tools to isolated farm families. If you lived in Southampton before the train, there were no roads to New York City. If you wanted to go to New York City from Southampton, it took 3 days in an ox cart with not paved roads, and you often traveled along the beach because beaches were better means of traveling than iffy roads that were wet or mucky or whatever. The fastest way to go from Southampton to New York City before the train was to go to Sag Harbor and catch a boat. You could do that in about 8 hours. A few wealthy young Jews arrived from well-established European families who helped them develop into a merchant class of bankers and trade store owners. They have an enormous impact on Long Island's Jewish immigrants by loaning money and supplying trade goods to the peddlers. The Panic of 1837 was a really big deal. Most people have forgotten about this panic, but it really was about 1 decade of hardship, very much like the Depression from the 1930s. It begins when Andrew Jackson withdraws federal funds from the Bank of the United States, which is no longer in existence, It creates a significant nationwide depression, except for one German Jew. August Belmont. He's born in Germany and comes to New York City in 1837 as an agent of the Rothschild Bank. His last name is Schoenberg, which means beautiful mountain in German. After arriving, he changes it to Belmont, which is French for beautiful mountain, which also sounds less Jewish. Belmont arrives during the panic and is an instant success, saving the Rothschilds' U.S. Bank interests over several years. Belmont is a good example of a prosperous German Jew who, after emigrating, joins New York City's merchant class community of department store owners, investment bankers, and clothing manufacturers. These successful merchants supplied Jewish peddlers with trade goods to take to Long Island and the East End. That's a great illustration, too, of New York City about 1850. Belmont develops a 1,000-acre estate in Babylon, where he breeds thoroughbred racehorses and plays polo with the nearby Whitneys. He calls it Stud Farm Nursery. The house is destroyed in 1920 and is soon acquired by New York State and becomes Belmont Lake State Park. Has anybody been there, Belmont? Okay, good. He also develops Belmont Park, a thoroughbred racing track located in Elmont, just outside Queens, which continues today. Just yesterday when I was going over this, I noticed Elmont. That's Belmont without the B. So that needs a little more research. Belmont becomes a Christian in order to marry Caroline, who's the daughter of Commodore Perry. She also comes from a wealthy family and a very high-status woman. The Belmonts are the most prominent leaders of society, and Mrs. Belmont's receptions are distinguished by the presence of everyone who really was worth knowing. She looks like a presence, doesn't she? Her entertainments were lavish. Society was impressed by her continental manners, the promise of exquisite cuisine and fine wines. August could not tolerate being separated from his horses. I'm sure that was a problem. So they were boarded inside the first floor of their Newport mansion. He dies in 1890 with an estate of $10 million. So Bell Court in Newport is open to the public. It's been transferring back and forth. When Belmont's son inherited the house, he took the stables out of the first floor, so you can't see the stables anymore. But it's privately owned but open to the public. Jim Crow. After the Civil War, anti-Semitism in New York City begins to intensify because of Jim Crow laws that restrict the sale of homes to African Americans, Asians, and Jews. Peddlers are the foot soldiers of the 19th century's Industrial Revolution. It is difficult and tiring work, but requires very little capital and promises substantial returns after a few years. Isn't that an amazing cart? It's all wheels. By 1845, the Long Island Railroad reaches Greenport, and 1870 arrives in Sag Harbor. Isn't that a great train? Look at that cab in the back. Jewish men purchase a variety of household goods, clothing, and kitchen utensils, usually on credit, from Jewish manufacturers in the city, and then travel by train to the various depots along the Long Island Railroad. That's Chatham Square in New York City, about 1880. Peddlers are getting off of the train. They're Jewish men carrying enormous loads on their backs to far-flung homesteads of Suffolk County. So they get off the train, and they got all this stuff, and then they start walking. Amazing. Helen Gerard collected oral histories of descendants of Jewish peddlers in Suffolk County in the 1970s. One man describes his uncle, and this is a quote from Helen Gerard's book. It's called Needles and Threads, and it's a really great book. She also wrote another article for a journal, for a history journal, It's called Yankee Yarmulkes. Great titles. Simon Levy was a big man. He must have been 75 years old when I was a kid, and he was built like a giant. He had such a pack that you couldn't pick up one end. He had clothes in it, everything that a woman would use, not expensive things. He left the Lower East Side, not knowing the language of this strange new land, forbidden to eat anything that was not kosher, and only on plates that had been kept separate for meat and milk products, an alien and a Jew in the bargain, to make his way as far east as the train would carry him, and then to start walking from farmhouse to farmhouse, an itinerant peddler. Successful peddlers eventually buy a horse and a cart, and after selling most of the goods, they pay a farmer located near a railroad depot to store the cart until he returns. That doesn't say anything about the horses, but I assume the horses stay behind too. If the cart was big enough, it would serve as a camper with a few family members. A wagon with 2 horses could hold an enormous amount of trade goods, and often an entire family. After years of saving for a shop, finally a store could be rented. Riverhead and Greenport, after the railroad comes through, are the first towns to have Jewish stores with homes usually above. Most shop owners keep their carts in the beginning. Helen Gerard again says in Yankees and Yarmulkes, identifies Zealot Kaplan with his cart and family in the front of their new home in Greenport, and this is about 1905. Sam Harding settles in Riverhead, Riverhead's Jewish community, and after a new synagogue is built in 1924, he purchased the old one and turns it into his second furniture store in Riverhead. Not all immigrants can tolerate life on the Lower East Side. Farming attracts Jews who are not happy in crowded streets and tenements. Some move to Suffolk County with limited success. But they have help. It is a hard life, but help becomes available when the Jewish Agricultural Society is created by Baron Maurice de Hirsch, a German Jewish philanthropist in New York City. The Baron spends his fortune providing loans for 5,000 Eastern European Jews to settle in American farms, many of whom have minimal experience as farmers. He publishes a magazine in Yiddish and in English, calling it The Jewish Farmer. By the mid-1880s, Russian Jewish immigrants joined earlier small populations of established German Jews in Sag Harbor, Riverhead, and Greenport. They create general stores, produce markets, and farms to support their families. That's the interior of a Jewish store owner in Greenport. Typically, Eastern European Jews work on farms or businesses owned by German Jews. In 1975, Etta Schlesinger related the extreme working conditions of her mother, Annie Schlesinger, on their Setauket farm. My mother took care of the store on the second floor of our house, and she milked all 16 cows. One day, she was bucked by a cow and half her breast ripped off. That's not all. She did her own washing, and while picking up a big boiler, it fell on her other breast. It was all burned by the hot water. Everyone was born at home, she continues. After 10 children, my mother was a torn wreck. Only 7 of us lived. The others died young of various childhood diseases. It was a terrible life for my mother, but I didn't realize it then. Sag Harbor is a major whaling port in 1850 when it begins to decline after whales become scarce from overfishing and the invention of kerosene. Tony, this is where you take over. The Bulliville Watch Factory. In 1880, Joseph Fahey moves his clockmaking factory from New Jersey to Sag Harbor. Fahey actively recruits at Ellis Island, hiring recent Jewish immigrants as they get off the boat from Russia, Poland, and Hungary. Some of the 40 to 50 Jewish men come with families. Others live in boarding houses and save until they can transport their families from either New York City or Eastern Europe to Sag Harbor. That's a great photograph of the workers in Bulova. In 1881, the death of a child creates a spiritual crisis for this small Jewish community. There is no cemetery. The Jewish Association of United Brethren of Sag Harbor is formed in 1883 to create a place of worship. Have you guys seen this archway on the road to East Hampton? It's created, they want to create a place of worship to aid sick members, supply a physician, contribute to funerals, and provide a burial ground. The association meets initially at Krause Hall in Sag Harbor and eventually forms Temple Mishkan Israel in 1883, the predecessor of today's Temple Adas Israel. Has anybody been to this temple? It's got such a great history. It's a very...
Great little museum in it, too.
Is there?
Yeah, really small, but...
I must have missed it.
It's in the basement.
That's why I missed it. There's only about 20 congregation. It's very small, I think, but they're marching on, so I've heard. But I think there's a new rabbi.
There isn't.
Yeah. The temple's first Torah is a gift from Theodore Roosevelt. In 1898, 1,200 Rough Riders led by Roosevelt during the Spanish-American War in Cuba landed at Camp Wyckoff in Montauk. Why? They are quarantined for 1 month before returning home because of an outbreak of yellow fever. During their stay, men hold worship services, including Shabbat services for Jewish soldiers. A Torah is purchased for this purpose. When Roosevelt leaves the camp, he donates the Torah to Temple Adas Israel. Around 1900, Levi Goldstein comes to Long Island as a peddler selling trinkets and pins for the wives of local farmers. His brother Hank joins him and they open a store in Eastport. In 1977, Lawrence Goldstein of Eastport talked about how he was raised by a peddler. I never wanted to go on the road with my father in the wagon. I let my brother do that. I worked in the store when I could first walk. I used to hang on to my mother, and you know, if you hang on to your mother and your mother's selling something, so do you. Now, it's just a part of me, I guess. Can you imagine that? My brother Herb loved to go out on the wagon. In later years, we got a truck, and he enlarged the route. Harry Goldstein and Sons had this store in Eastport, which is now owned by Lloyd Gerard, great-great-grandson of Levi Goldstein. They've been going out of business, I think, for about 10 years. And has anybody been in the store? It's fantastic. The merchandise never changes. It's too high price for anybody to buy, but it's the best museum I've ever been in. It's the museum of stuff. It's so great. It's worth the stop. The family of Samuel Sheckman were Russian Jews who escaped violent prosecution to immigrate to New York City. They moved to Brooklyn, where they became U.S. citizens, and finally moved out to Riverhead in 1927. The story of the Russian pogroms is a whole other lecture. It's horrible. The family opens 2 businesses on Main Street, one selling shoes and the other officially authorized prohibition alcohol. That was quite a document. I would love to see that. Officially authorized prohibition alcohol. The family gathers in 1927 for the 25th anniversary, which celebrates the Sheckman family of Riverhead and the Barish family of Freeport. The birdcage. Southampton, for the most of the 19th century, is a sleepy agrarian village that changes in 1870 when Dr. Galliard Thomas arrives. So the birdcage is sort of around where the bathing corporation is, where the parking lot, the church. It's no longer there, but it was the first mansion that was built in Southampton, and it created quite a stir. You can imagine, the house, the birdcage, is still surrounded by farms in the 1870s when this was built. So a farmer to the left or the right could have been seen, plowing a pasture when this looks like a spaceship from Mars just lands there. So local people called it the birdcage. Dr. Thomas is a very successful gynecologist specializing in female hysteria among the elite of New York City. He brings his wealthy clients, mostly women, to this pastoral village on the ocean to restore their health. He is not Jewish, but he plays an important role in those that settle in Southampton. Prosperous tourists soon follow to spend the summer in boarding houses owned by local families. Do you recognize the Post House on Post Crossing? That's what it looked like when it was a boarding house in 1910. These tourists return to build sprawling cottages for their large households of family and servants during Southampton's Gilded Age, 1880 to 1929. So that's Ballyshire. Everybody's heard Michael Bloomberg lives here now. So he lives at the corner of White Street and
What?
Barker's Island.
Oh, Barker's Island.
It's on the north side of 39. You can't see it. It's surrounded by hedges, but that's what it looked like probably in 1920. The new summer colony quickly grows and is in need of fashionable consumer goods, produce, and services. This provides an opportunity for small Jewish business owners to open trade shops and supply the new demand. That is South Main Street. That's the east side of South Main Street. It's unrecognized. It doesn't look like that at all today. But what's different about this postcard from the 1920s is that there's no privets. And privet vents, you may know, were only became fashionable after air conditioning was available because you wanted all the breezes from the ocean that you could. Southampton has several Jewish stores and businesses that open and close over the years. Most have not survived. Mrs. Enoch's was a fashionable hat store. And I go up and down the street looking for this building. It's not going to look like this, but I know it's there. It's someplace. It's been changed. It's been altered. Does
It's
anybody recognize
75 Main Street.
where?
75 Main Street?
Oh my God!
Yeah,
So that's where the
75
restaurant.
Main?
There's a restaurant on the bottom.
restaurant, yeah. And all the fancy stuff is gone, but
Right.
that's the building.
And then it was the Anchorage, right?
No.
Was that the Anchorage
With your help.
later? Yeah.
Anchorage was over there somewhere. I
It
didn't know
was-
that.
it
So Richard York Shoes closed up recently. That's where I bought my shoes when I first came here. It was owned and managed for 3 generations. Mitch Hagler, grandson of the founder, closes the business in 2011 because of rising rents. That happens a lot here, doesn't it? Israel Frank, an Orthodox Jew, immigrates to the Lower East Side from Lithuania and becomes a peddler. He carries 2 packs, one to rest on his chest and the other on his back. He travels to the east end of Long Island by train, not knowing the language, forbidden to eat anything that was not kosher, and eats only on plates they keep separate for meat, milk, products, walking farmhouse to farmhouse. I think this is a repeat of another slide. Anyway, Israel prospers and purchases the Orion Hotel on Main Street to open a store. He and his wife Rachel raised 6 children above the shop. And there's a great book written by his son Abe Frank called
Alone, but what is it?
I can't think of it. Anyway, look up Abe Frank. This is a great little book. It's a great read about growing up Jewish in the Hamptons. Schulman's Five and Dime is located on Main Street for many years, along with Schur's men's clothing store at the corner of Job's Lane and Main Street.
In Goulds, right?
In 1923, the Silver family opens the United Cigar Store and Newsstand. I think every time I mention this, everybody goes, "Oh, I remember this." Penny, I think you do.
Well, Florence is here in our audience.
Florence
today.
Silver?
Florence.
Oh, yes.
Florence.
Florence is the daughter of the family, right, Florence?
Yes.
So many people remember the store, and it was, everybody loved this store. Florence, well, you should open another.
So Silver's moved from its, Florence, tell them about the original location.
Well, that was the store where DJ's is now, and then there's another dress store, and then there's foods, it used to be the cheese shop, it might still be the cheese shop.
Cheese shop, yeah.
That was the original Silver Cigar Store. Actually, the original was across the street, but they moved there in 1929. And my aunt and uncle had the Style Shop, which is now DJ's. And I think in the 50s, my father bought this store, which is now the restaurant.
Do you recognize this guy?
Yeah.
So
Howard is my nephew.
that's
What was that?
God, right? That's a great bar and register. The Goldberg's original bakery begins with Artie Goldberg, who develops a chain of bagel stores in Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx with his brothers. Why am I talking about this? Because the great Goldberg's Bagel Store. Several years ago, Artie's great-grandson, Mark, moves to East Hampton and opens Goldberg's famous bagel shops. The first one in Southampton, and there's many more now scattered along Long Island. I have one in my neighborhood in Mattituck now. Mark Press Moving and Storage. The Press family has operated a combination moving, storage, and laundry business on Route 39 for several generations. Descendants Mark Press and Paula Press Hoffman are managing the operation today. In the 1940s, Bill Paley is a highly successful businessman who developed CBS from a small radio station to the top television station in the U.S. His family is Jewish and came to the U.S. from the Ukraine. They built a successful cigar factory in Chicago. And I think he's smoking a cigar. And if you look at his hand, it looks like one. When Bill marries Barbara Cushing Mortimer, better known as Babe, she was a local girl, in the 1970s, they purchased 4 fountains on Halsey Neck Road, which is originally built to be a performing arts center. Do you recognize the gate posts with the falcons on them?
Yes.
You can still see it on Halsey Neck Road. So in the 1920s, it was built by a couple who were show people or something like that, and they wanted it to be a theater. Babe loses her membership in Southampton's exclusive clubs because Bill is Jewish. They formed their own social network of celebrities, including the Duchess of Windsor. That's not so bad. And they were often seen at Herb McCarthy's restaurant. And this is my last slide, and I think it's very interesting. These are my neighbors. Eve and Chris Kaplan Walbrecht moved from Brooklyn in 2003 to start a CSA organic farm on Sound Avenue at the end of Northfield Road. Has anybody seen this? When you drive up to the North Fork and you make a right on Sound Avenue, there's Garden of Eve. They partner with a synagogue in New York City supplying produce along with organic farming workshops. So they still have a connection, just like the old days, to Brooklyn. Not like peddlers, but as farmers. I just think that's a good way to end this lecture. I'm new at this topic, so if anybody has anything to add, I don't think I can answer any
Tom,
questions.
I think there are a couple of people maybe in this audience who have their a little story to tell.
Okay.
So if we could ask them to come up and maybe
Sure.
speak to this microphone.
Anybody want to come up and
Well, Alan
share a story?
Carlo has-
Alan?
So we'll just ask you to speak into the microphone.
I'm Alan DiCarlo, nice Italian name, right? As in most family histories like your own, it's not as simple as that. My mother, who was born and raised in Texas, has the last name of Cooper. And I have a second cousin in Texas who got me very interested in genealogy, so I have spent a long time doing family history. My father's side can be discarded almost immediately. They were lived in a little mountain village in Italy, and they all married each other's cousins. So that just gets thrown out the back door. My mother was raised on a subsistence farm. However, my third great-grandfather, her great-great-grandfather, fought with Sam Houston in the Texas War of Independence, and his name is enshrined on the monument at San Jacinto. Going back a little further on that line, I have 3 fifth-grade grandfathers who fought in the Revolutionary War, including one who was an adjutant to Nathaniel Greene. So, like you, I'm one of the Sons of the American Revolution, and a bunch of other clubs. Well, anyway, so I'm doing genealogy, and I kind of lost the Cooper line because I made a mistake when I was tracing my ancestry, and then I went back to it. It turns out that the Coopers were Sephardic Jews. They probably came from Portugal or Spain. Thomas Cooper in the 1600s, for reasons that are unknown, had all of his worldly goods confiscated by the crown. Not an old story for Jews, I don't think. And his son, James Cooper, came to America in the late 1600s, early 1700s. Contemporary with James is another Sephardic Jew who came to the Americas, Isaac Laban. Now, they settled in Virginia, probably in Western Virginia. James was known to have had a large plantation. Isaac married the daughter of 2 Choctaw Indians. James' son, William, married Isaac Laban's daughter, so she was half Choctaw Indian. William Cooper, interestingly enough, born in 1725, was a Spanish-speaking scout for Daniel Boone, was one of the first men to plant corn in Kentucky, and had 2 sons. Oh, I forgot, he was killed in the Battle of Nashboro, which was an Indian fight in the Indian Wars. So he married a half Indian, was killed by Indians, quite ironic. He had 2 sons. Thomas was my 4th or 5th great grandfather. I lose track, I don't want to look at my notes. Who started the first Masonic Lodge in North Carolina. Now, Masonic lodges used to be called temples, and I happen to be a Mason. There's a lot of controversy about whether or not Masons have any link to Judaism, but if you go to a Masonic lodge, it's basically oriented east to west, and it's built on the principle of Solomon's temple. As you know, Solomon's temple was started, the chief architect was Hiram, who was Jewish, and felt that Masonry originated in Egypt before the Jews settled in the Middle East when they came over with Moses. And in the Masonic temple, there are the 2 pillars of the Temple of Solomon, Jacob and Boaz. So I think that even though I argue with fellow Masons about Jewish links to Masonry, they say no, that's not true. However, they don't believe in Jesus Christ. They believe in a supreme being, and they divert their religious beliefs to St. John the Baptist and St. John the Evangelist. Getting back to the Coopers. This is the second slide that you had was done by David Von Martine,
Yes.
who was a local artist. This is my first cousin, 5 times removed. Okay.
Can you show it over here?
This is a portrait done from photograph by David, who was a friend of mine, a walking encyclopedia of Native American history on the West.
What's his name?
This is John Houston Cooper. John is therefore a Choctaw Sephardic Jew. American Indian Sephardic Jew. He's asked by Andrew Jackson during the War of 1812 to go fight with him on the promise that he would be able to keep his property in Tennessee. So he takes his men to go and fight. It is likely, I don't know this for sure, it is likely that he fought with Jackson at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in central Alabama. This is where the Upper Creek Red Stick Indians sided with the British because they thought that their land was going to be taken over by the Americans, and if they sided with the British in the war, that perhaps they'd be able to retain their land. However, they, they lost. In so doing, they lost 2.3 million acres of their property. This man went back home, and shortly after he got back home, his property and his land was confiscated as well. About 1.9 million acres of Cherokee property was taken, and these people were put on the Trail of Tears, which is nothing better than the Bataan Death March. So, my mother, as far as family lore is concerned, my mother used to say, you know, we're part Indian, and we're also French Huguenots. Well, no. Indians, yes. Sephardic Jews, yes. These people settled in Appalachia. It's pretty well known that some Sephardic Jews had variations in skin color from light to dark. Perhaps the Indians were the only ones who would have them. They were known as Melungeons, melange coming from the French word meaning mixture. And a lot of them practiced, you know, about crypto-Judaism. Crypto-Jews, especially in Spain. The conversos would practice in secret their old customs. And if they were caught, then they were interrogated in the Inquisition and burned at the stake. There's a story of a man who married a light-skinned woman who did not tell her husband of her ancestry. And when their first child was born dark-skinned, he thought that she had an affair with someone, so he killed them both. Well, these genes can penetrate for a long time. My mother used to call him my little Indian. He's dark-skinned, he doesn't sunburn, and he looks like an Indian. But that pretty much summarizes the story. I thought you might be interested in knowing that besides coming here in the time frame that you mentioned, that there was a lot of Jewish penetration into the Americas in the early 1700s.
Alan, I have to tell you, my Jewish grandmother's maiden name was Cooper. So we may be related.
We'll have to find out. Your mother's grandmother's name is?
Yeah.
In the European, when people remain, the family name generally reflected the industry or their profession. And Cooper was a barrel maker. So in any of the research, go back in the lineage and discover that that's what somebody did in the family.
Oh, sure.
The name came
Yeah.
from.
Another side of my family are carpenters for like kinjet generation. They would have to be carpenters. Of course, everybody was a
And
carpenter.
my last name is Holtz, and German it was Wood, and they were workers in woodland.
Any other questions? Yes.
I wanted to ask if you ever came across any signs that said Sway John?
No.
Yeah, my
Why?
husband was 60, but he used to tell that when the first time he went to Fire Island, there were signs that said Sway John. If you spell it backwards, it's no Jews.
No. Wow.
So I wondered if you came
No.
across that with your research.
The problem is, it's like my museum, you know, we have just one view of history. And why do we have that? Is because all the English Protestants donated their stuff
Yeah.
to preserve their history. You know, it's time for me included to start sharing the wealth. And with the internet, I think it's a lot easier. But that's very interesting.
Yeah, I wondered if you.
No, I have not.
Yeah.
Any other comments?
Is any,
What-
where you want to come up here? Or is it just a short comment?
I have a question.
The family of a friend of mine bought a pillow and sheet place in where? At the dry goods store in one of the towns here. And they were Jewish and the family doing, and the people that lived in that town and around that town were members of the KKK. They had a very good KKK in that area. And one of the members of the KKK came in and invited him to a meeting. And he told him, well, why should I come to a meeting when you're going to do and say things about me? And he said, well, we're not that hard on the Jew people. We're hard on the black people. And he felt he had to go to the meeting because they were the biggest purchasers of sheets and pillowcases.
Yes, go ahead.
When I bought my house out here back in the early 90s, a friend of mine warned me and said, don't buy in Southampton, it's anti-Semitic. And I didn't listen before the Southampton and Waterloo. So my question is, are there still remnants of anti-Semitism?
Oh, sure. I'm in a,
Someone told me the beach club here.
Yeah. When I was working at the Parish Art Museum in the 70s, one of our board members, who was a wonderful gentleman, applied for membership. And he was distinguished in every way possible. And he was rejected because he was Jewish. And
And
he,
that's still today. I heard you could only get in if you, by invitation.
I don't know.
it's a long process, but the reason that the other beach club, the Bathroom Tennis Club, was built, it was developed by Irish Catholics and Jews, so they would have a place to go.
Which one?
Well, George Submergent, who was,
That's the one closer to Old Town Pond.
no, that's not, I don't know, Tom. George Submergent totally started that club from scratch. And I mean, he may have
This is what I.
had that in mind, but the original membership of that club was just sort of a local Southampton club.
Exactly.
It was not at all like people from there, people couldn't get into other clubs. It was just an alternative for people who were local.
Well, it's really hard to get into the bathing corporations. It really
And
is
a
impossible.
lot of jumping around, yeah.
So they were welcoming everybody.
They were welcoming everyone.
So including Irish and Jews.
Yeah.
But I should say, I come across as mostly WASP, but I come across anti-Semitism a couple times a year. People make anti-Semitic cracks. And I've got the greatest comeback. And I say, well, I'm part Jew. And your mouth's shut. Anything else? Yes.
The story is that my mother taught, and when I was a little baby, and my dad was a lawyer, they wanted to go someplace in the summer, or she could go, and my dad could come out. So the doctor said, well, we go to East Hampton, but my wife is society, and my parents weren't society. And but he said, well, you might like Sag Harbor. They had never heard of Sag Harbor. They came out, and it was 1939, and they were pretty nervous because there was a lot of anti-Semitism around. And the story is they looked in a phone book, called it somebody named Cohn, and said, how is it in Sag Harbor? And he said, it's fine, there's even a temple. And so we started coming in 1939 in the summer, and now I live here. And my one daughter was the first one to have a bat mitzvah in the temple in Sag Harbor.
Wow. Cool.
The temple in Sag Harbor is the oldest existing temple on Long Island.
Yes, yes.
Yes.
Are there any other Jewish cemeteries or burial grounds other than the one in Sag Harbor around 114?
I'm sure there's a lot we don't know about.
Would you talk about some more stories?
East Hampton has a Jewish cemetery.
Do you want to talk about more stories?
But, people didn't go to cemeteries. If you had a relative, in the 19th century that died, you put them in the backyard. So that was common. Okay, thank you very much.